Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Seems quite loud. Roland, can you turn this down? Just turned it up.
Is that because this is on? No, it's because this is very loud. All right, I'll just. Yeah. Madam Clerk. Wrong perception. You can read the first routine application.
Routine application, HD4, the Health Department, approval to use $73,674.88.
Second by Mr. Mason. Discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions. The next is a non-routine application from the Budget Committee. Mr. Mason.
LAW1 for the Law Department is a release of conditions for professional and other special services attorney's fees for $600,000, and I so move the item.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
If I may,
Mr. Mason.
This is a release of conditions for outside counsel within the Law Department. During our last year's litigation cost and attention towards the overall strategy for our law department operations. These large expenses to date have been mainly from three large cases: Hardy, a police discrimination case; Kempner, the beach access case; and the Honolulu case within the police department. Attorney Fox indicated that this year's appropriation should be ample to cover the remainder of this fiscal year. Our Law Committee has also reviewed this item and indicated their support to release the condition at this time. As a slight sideline, both committees, the Law Committee, who also gave us a report on this, are concerned that we continually improve and drive the lessons learned from such items like this to reduce any and all types of litigation when possible. Our vote was 4-0 to release.
Other discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Moving on to the non-routine applications from the Law Committee, I believe.
Mr. Chairman, I believe both of these are actually routine applications.
Yes.
And I will go through both of them then together.
Sure. Madam Clerk, can you just read them in, and then we'll take Mr. Campbell up for discussion.
Yes. I so move SE12, First Selectman's Office, additional appropriation of
$10,000.
$10,000, and SE13, First Selectman, additional appropriation of $14,031.17.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington.
Second.
Second by Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell, discussion.
The first proposed settlement, DeMaio versus the Town of Greenwich, for $10,000. It's a personal injury case arising out of a fall by an Election Day worker while working at the polls in Greenwich on Election Day 2005. The Law Committee approved the proposed settlement on November 2nd by a vote of 2-0. The second item, Allstate Insurance versus the Town of Greenwich, is a claim for damages arising out of a motor vehicle accident between the plaintiff's insured and a Town of Greenwich truck on August 1st of last year on Arch Street. The Law Committee approved the proposed settlement on November 2nd by a vote of 2-0.
Further discussion? All those in favor for SC12 and SC13 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Can I ask one question?
Mr. Simon.
I don't know if this works. At what point do these two documents become public, or do they ever become public? And or they always remain confidential?
The opinions of council are always confidential.
All right. Even after we've settled?
Yes. They reflect the thought processes of the town and the particulars of the case, and do not lose their privilege merely because the case has been settled.
Moving along to item 3 of the agenda, the assessor's report. Mr. Gwartney is here along with Mr. Shipp. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. You have my report in front of you. We're basically completing our activities on the 2008 grand list preparation at this time. And later on this evening, I think we're scheduled to discuss the staffing plan for the assessment department and the budget. I'll be glad to answer any questions about the report.
Any questions for Mr. Gwartney relative to his report and not his presentation on the staffing? Mr. Campbell.
I just had one question, and maybe it's because it's the first time I've seen this since it comes up at this point in the annual cycle, but on page 1, personal property, you note that approximately 2,800 of the 4,400 annual declarations have been returned. Is that normal, that rate of return, or that failure rate, I guess I could call it?
That is normal, yes.
Other questions for the assessor? Mr. Simon.
I have 2 comments to make. Under the number 4 cases stipulated, the 2 cases that were stipulated, the town received 92.2% of the dollars. So that part I thought was pretty good so far. And then under number 3, revaluation progress report, Mrs. Tarkington and I met at the end of October with Mr. Gwartney, and the key part to the 2009 revaluation is having enough home sales between now and September 30th of 2009 to do a proper evaluation. We would need somewhere in the range of 350 home sales to do this revaluation, and we will probably know better where we stand in the summer of 2009. And we'll be, it would be helpful if that's a statistic that we think is important, that Mr. Gwartney continue to update us with how many home sales we have for the current fiscal year.
Any other questions for Mr. Gwartney? Is there a motion to accept Mr. Gwartney's report?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Norton. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? BET Committee and Special Project Team reports you should have received in your packet. Before you, the Audit Committee, the Human Resources Committee, the Nathaniel Witherell Town Building Committee, the Ad Hoc OPEB Committee, the OPEB Trust, the Havemeyer Old Town Hall Project, and the Glenville School Building Committee. I'm going to ask at this time if Mr. Mynarski, if you could just talk to the board a little bit about Nathaniel Witherell and the process that we've asked you to undertake relative to the $50,000 for the audit, and just give us an update as to where we are, generally speaking, with that process and what you're doing now.
About a week or 2 ago, I did develop a 3-page scope. I went back to the original RFP done about 4 or 5 years ago, and I tried to tie it in to the questions that may be asked and duties that might be performed by a third-party, independent, objective, qualified vendor on the business plan that was given out to the BET in January, I believe, of 2007. So the scope has been developed, and because of the timing, we'll probably approach a vendor, which was given to us from, I believe, David Ormsby, and get a bid waiver, preferably from the town administrator, to speed up the process. What I need from the BET or the chairman is approval of the scope so that I can go forward, and then I can negotiate a price and a time frame for when this assignment can be done. Again, the emphasis is that we want to fast track this so that it's done within the next 60 days from when we do the assignment.
And just so that the BET is aware of making sure that everybody's on the same page, we appropriated or approved $50,000 in the current fiscal year to look at Nathaniel Witherell to give us what I would call it an independent assessment as to where they are relative to their business plan. Because in all likelihood, we will be receiving a request for Project Renew either within the next budget cycle or during the next budget process. And so before a building is built that is, or designed, that is different from the business plan, we want to make sure everybody's on the same page relative to the business plan and the actual experience that the town has had over the past year and a half. Ms. Tarkington, is that about where we are with this?
That's correct, although I think if you, my report indicates that Witherell has now hired an architect, the SLAM Collaborative, to proceed and do some design. So this process becomes critical to move forward at this point in time.
Mr. Stone, let me just say, it is expected that we will vote on a firm at our December meeting.
Yes.
And move the process forward that way. Mr. Stone.
Did I hear you say that we're going to be getting the name of the suggested consultant from Mr. Ormsby?
I have that name through an email.
I'm not questioning the mechanism. I guess I'm questioning the approach. We're trying, I think, to get an independent view about the nursing home's business plan.
Okay.
It hardly seems consistent that we'd be getting the name of the consultant to review that business plan from the nursing home.
Yeah, let me
What
try
am I
to.
missing?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think this universe is a small universe. It's one name as a result of many names that were given to us. And we've gone out already and looked at companies who, quite frankly, have told us they do not wish to even offer their services relative to this. Either one, they've already worked on it before and would be tainted in that fashion, or hope to do work in the future that is much broader in scope than this quote-unquote audit. Right. Make no mistake about it, and I've talked to Mr. Ormsby about this, this would be a project of the BET, the client would be the BET, and the scope of work is being solely developed by the finance department, not without any real input from Nathaniel Witherell. And so this was always set up, and I've had several communications with Mr. Ormsby about that. They're looking forward to the results as well, but clearly the results come to us as the client. It was the one suggestion that was provided was simply because they're the closest to that type of environment and gave us a list. If they could have given us a list of 3 or 4, they would have. They were only able to come up with one name.
And have we satisfied ourselves that that's one, maybe the only legitimate remaining name out there, and if it is, that firm has a standing that is recognized within the financial community as being solid and independent?
We will do due diligence through the finance department, and once I get the approval of the scope, I will do a background check the best I can on the firm, and I mean, like Mr. Walker said, they're more qualified to say who's out there. For example, I can say who's out there as far as auditors or maybe actuaries. They're more qualified in the area of nursing homes to suggest somebody that's out there, and the independents will be there. But to answer your question, I'll do the diligence as far as checking out the firm's financials, just like any other RFP when you do a background check.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Norton.
Before you conclude with the reports of the standing committees, I just want to remind everybody that it's the intent of the audit committee to bring the fiscal 2008 audit report to this board for its approval at our next meeting, which is, I believe, the 15th of December. And to accomplish that, we have scheduled a special meeting to receive the first draft of the audit report, the financials, and the management letter on December 3rd at 8 a.m. And we hope to approve or recommend to the board at our December 11th meeting the audit, completed audit.
Thank you. Mr. Mynarski, any other questions on the special project teams or the reports that were generated? Okay, Mr. Mynarski, Comptroller's report.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and VET members. Two items before I open it up to questions. The first selectman was kind enough to invite Roland Geiger and myself to a conference call from Governor Rell to the towns and cities in the state of Connecticut that participated. And bear with me, I'm just putting this together now, and I'm going to read from the notes that I took. And Roland, or the first selectman, will correct me if I misspeak. It was a muted call, meaning that the governor spoke and there was no open question and answers. When she ended the conversation, the call was over with. She started out by saying the bad news to begin was they've lost $370 million year to date on a variety of revenue shortfalls to include corporate income taxes, sales tax revenues, and casinos, mainly covering these $370 million. She did say, with assistance from her budget director, that the state of Connecticut currently has between $1.2 and $1.3 million in a rainy day fund. Well, what did I say, million? That's the equivalent of what we call the general fund here. They have a name for it called the rainy day fund. So they can tap for the current year on the $1.2 to $1.3 billion rainy day fund. The shortfall for 09-010 per the governor is $2.6 billion. The shortfall for 10-11 is $3.3 billion, which comes to almost $6 billion. She also did say that the unemployment rate in the state is spiked up to 6.6%. And she offered what she thought would be solutions without going into a lot of detail. It would be to get out of the mess, in her quote, her words, is a combination of cuts, consolidation of agencies, and the ability to tap additional revenue sources, for example, elimination of certain tax breaks. Again, didn't go into specifics on any of these. At the end, she offered what she termed as good news, which many of us probably will not, is the fact that her economists and experts in the field feel that the bottom will come at the third or final quarter of 2009. So basically, I thank the first selectman, and that's, unfortunately, we bring bad news, which a lot of us already knew about, but that's the report from the governor. And because it was at 3 o'clock today, I didn't have a chance to get into the comptroller's report. Any questions? And before I move on to the comptroller's report? Mr. Stone?
On the report.
Oh, I have one more special good news announcement. For the second year, we have an employee in the finance department that was recognized as manager of the year. Last year, Roland Geiger was the recipient. This year, we have Mr. Roy Carey, a longstanding accounts payable accounts payable supervisor. And we also have in the same division of the finance department accounts payable, Mary Kralik, who was given the Team Player of the Year award. So we have two more recipients, and I congratulate them. I could attest that they are excellent employees and well deserving of this award. I had one more, and I'll open it up to questions. I did mention in there, and I plan to have a cash forecast for the board. We do have it ready, but my preference would be that I run it through Art Norton and Mr. Bill Finger at the Investment Advisory Committee, and the cash forecast will be a monthly report attached to the Comptroller's report going forward. Any questions?
Mr. Stone.
Some of us have been following fairly closely the projected borrowings that, or let's call it the refinancing that's focused on for January. And I notice in your report that besides the refinancing of the $45 million, you're expecting then to be going out for for new money of 27 million?
Yes.
Why is that? Why would you be doing it at that time?
That's a combination of what we've spent to date. For example, the Board of Education does a lot of their work in July and August. We've probably got about $8 million already spent. And what the cash flow projections will be between now and 12 months from the end of January 2009. So we project, as of today, we'll need an additional $27 million of new money. $45 million will be rolled over and $27 will be new money.
Mr. Simon.
We're sharing the microphone over here because you guys moved down. You guys have to move down. Anyways,
Tightening our belts.
you know, I brought this issue up before that, you know, there's a cost to going out more than once in the bond market of issuing it, but we're receiving negative amortization, negative arbitrage on the money we're borrowing, and whether we should then maybe wait until take a better cash flow and wait till March or April and measure what the interest cost difference is versus the cost of going out to the bond market more than once before you make a decision again to go out only in January, because there is a cost to the town of doing that.
My question to you is, you're saying take a bridge loan from January 29th out to March and then...
well, you may not need all $72 million in January, because
Correct.
$72 million carries you for the next 12 months. Maybe you take out some in January and you borrow more money again in May and maybe some in August.
To take advantage of the interest rates.
Well, and the fact that when we borrow the money in January, we're paying more interest than we're earning. So we have a negative loss there.
Negative carry.
We could do a cost-benefit analysis to
And
see...
then, as compared to the cost of going out multiple times. And then at least go through the same discussion with the investment committee when you do the cash flow forecast.
Okay.
Other questions or discussion for the comptroller? Mr. Mynarski, please wish Ms. Kralik and Mr. Carey on behalf of the BET for their fine work. We applaud them for earning that recognition.
And just as an add-on, I failed to say, the awards ceremony is this Thursday, November 20th, at 12 noon. It's in the Greenwich Library Cole Auditorium. First Selectman and Maureen Cass do a very good job, and if you want to, there's a whole array of awards that are given out. I recommend that you do come.
Treasurer's report. Is there any discussion on the treasurer's report? First, let me take the comptroller's report. Can I have a motion to accept the comptroller's report? So moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Stone. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Treasurer's report. Questions, discussion? Do I have a motion? Moved by Mr. Norton. Second by Mr. Finger. All those in favor? Aye. Number 7 on our agenda comes before us. Approval of BET regular meeting minutes for October 20th, 2008. At this time, let me thank again Ms. Tarkington and Ms. Bocchino for getting these minutes out with the new FOI requirements. I know it's a chore to get them up and get them online, and we do appreciate all of your work. Any comments to the minutes? Question, Mr. Simon?
Are these the same minutes that we saw after the 7 days after the meeting, or are they changed?
No, there have been no changes. They include any comments that came in prior to, putting them on the
Very good.
website.
I just wanted to know that. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Is there a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Finger. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Number 8 comes before us, officers' report. Mr. Stone, do you have anything?
No.
Ms. Tarkington?
No, I don't.
It just, in addition to the Nathaniel Witherell comments that were made by Mr. Mynarski, obviously everyone knows I also serve on the Hamilton Avenue Building Committee. I would say that this Thursday is our next meeting. We anticipate knowing at that time whether or not the air balancing remediation work has worked. My understanding is that the testers and the engineers are at the site today, tomorrow, and potentially Wednesday. That while we won't have a final report on Thursday, Pinnacle One, the project manager, anticipates knowing whether or not the air balancing report is positive or negative. If it is positive, that seems to be the last major impediment to obtaining a TCO or a CO, and therefore the likelihood of having a move in December would be great. If, however, the report comes back in the negative and that there are additional issues or remedial action that needs to be taken relative to the air system, based on prior work, it does not appear that remedial work would be able to be contemplated and completed and then retested within a matter of 2 weeks in order to turn over the building to the Board of Ed in time to test it and then make a move in December. So really, Thursday will be very telling as to whether or not, in my estimation, a move can occur in December. The good news is it is progressing to the point where there are very few items left other than the major items that we keep on talking about. There are still issues with the garage. There are still some punch list items, although that punch list is, for the most part, completed. And we're moving forward in all aspects from the garage and getting a TCO. You should also be advised that the building committee approved a decrease in the amount of retainage to Worth Construction from about $1 million of retainage down to now $500,000. So they released about $500,000 of retainage. With the only condition on that was that the air balancing report be positive, or that we receive a positive air balancing report. So once again, it behooves, I think, everybody, and certainly there's now an incentive out there that this air balancing report be approved, and that a move be able to occur in December. Other than that, I continue to have monthly meetings with the first selectman, gearing up for the budget cycle and process, to be able to then turn over the budget to the budget committee and start in earnest in February. That is all I have from the officer's report. Under old business, number 9 now comes before us, discussion and vote on Hay study. For that, I call on the chairman of our HR committee, Ms. Tarkington.
Mr. Chairman, we will not proceed with that vote today. We've been working with the appointing authorities, and one yet has indicated that it needs additional time. The revised pay plan includes new grades and market-based salary ranges with a minimum, midpoint, and maximum identified for each grade. You will get a copy of the salary ranges together with the process for approving raises in your package for next month. As you're aware, after extensive research, the new pay plan offers more control over salary increases, better internal equity, aids recruitment, allows for market adjustments, and is tied for performance. Again, since we're delaying our approval this month to accommodate one of the appointing authorities, we hope that the Human Resources Director will move ahead and develop and continue to develop a robust performance plan to train employees regarding how this plan will work, including how to define goals and reach objectives. And she, I believe, is proceeding on that basis. And so we have some work to do. The appointing authority plans to come before the HR committee at next month's meeting, which is December 10th. And we expect at that point in time the HR committee will approve a plan that it will be presenting at next month's December's board meeting, December 15th.
Thank you, Ms. Tarkington. There seems to be, I think, a couple of legal questions that are out there that maybe we should actually get in writing from the law department, although I think they've answered some of these questions verbally when asked. But I think it's important that we sort of nail this down so that there's not an issue going forward, and that is whether or not, one, all appointing authorities must officially sign off on it, and if not, what are the consequences? What is the effect of that? But then, two, what is the role of the RTM? Historically, the RTM has approved the pay plan. And if they approve this pay plan, which I think is anticipated in the sequencing of events, then in fact, if the RTM does approve it, does that have, once again, a binding effect on all appointing authorities, irrespective of whether they independently accept or reject the pay plan? And I think it's just going to make the process and the discussion next month go a lot smoother if we have that information available in writing that it's already been answered. The only other question I have, I think, is for Ms. Cast, if you can. I saw an agenda of one of the appointing authorities, and they still listed this item on their agenda as an executive session discussion, as opposed to having the discussion, a public discussion. I suspect that if they're talking about individuals and performance, that probably is appropriate for executive session. But generically now, this plan is out there, yes, and it should be discussed publicly so that the public can get a sense as to where each appointing authority is, and the vote on this should be public. Is that your sense as well?
That is correct, and we were in public session at the HR committee meeting when we shared the plan. But I agree, if it's about a specific individual's performance or salary, that would be held in executive session.
But ultimately,
that's not the plan.
Right. The vote itself on the plan should be public so that
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions regarding the pay plan? It seems like we're teeing this one up and maybe some others tonight for a real vote in December. I would ask that you, if there are any concerns regarding this Hay study, a lot of work has already gone into it, but certainly now is the time to get the questions out so that the HR committee can have a robust discussion in December. Mr. Simon.
I asked the HR committee, when they transmit the final documents to the BET in December, to accompany that with a memo, a succinct memo saying, please attach, please find A, B, and C, and here's what we're going to ask you to approve, so that I have this thick document of material and I know exactly what I'm supposed to approve, who's bought in, what the process is. More or less distilled down to the germane issues that I have to consider. I realize that's like having someone else do my homework, but it's helpful.
Is it anticipated that by next month we will have a response from all appointing authorities? Is the HR department actually going to ask to see if formal votes were taken by all the appointing authorities?
Although I informally have sort of a tally of the appointing authorities. I have appointing authority here who is in favor of the plan.
Having gone through this, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. First Selectman.
The purpose of the meetings to explain the intent of the plan was to specifically get feedback so that we knew going forward if there was a varied unrest about it. And I received at least one written reply, which I copy you on, from Mr. Heller, and several verbal replies. There are several individuals, as we indicated, out of the some 50 to 60 covered by the plan, where there are issues that are being addressed by Maureen on a case-by-case basis. But by and large, there's been support, particularly, as I said, particularly as it relates to the performance component of the plan.
I guess it depends. If the legal opinion says that we do need all of the appointing authorities, then that's obviously a document the analysis as to who's approved it and who hasn't would be important. If the answer, as I think it is that we do not need all the appointing authority responses, then obviously I don't want extra work to be done just for the sake of tabulating who's on board and who's not. But to the extent that you can give any even general description as to where the appointing authorities are on this, I know there is general support for it, but I think to the extent that you can
As far as I know, no formal votes are necessary because they essentially maybe request a salary, but by virtue of the fact you're approving it, you're setting in place the salary ranges. So you're the ultimate authority, as you know, and we're in a sense the administrator of the salary program.
That's what I believe the opinion to be as well, but I just think for next month it's wise to have that in writing so that even the appointing authorities are recognize that that's the opinion of the town attorney. Okay. Any other question on this topic? Oh, yes, sir.
My name is Dave Brownwood. I'm the president of the board of the Greenwich Library, and my only function here is to say that we are fully in support of the Hay Plan. It will, in the case of the library, bring the director and the deputy director salaries much more in line with market, and we appreciate all the work that's gone into it. Thank you.
Sir, while you're here, you're now looking for a director, correct?
We are in the search process right now.
So have you used this at least as a guidepost in your search?
We have told the candidates that the maximum salary is the current maximum. We have also told the candidates, and they've been happy to hear, but we've made no promises, of course, but we've said that the salary range is under consideration by the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and we may have better news for them down the line.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet.
Other questions or comments? So we'll take this up in December. Great. Thank you. Number 10 now comes before us under new business. First one is the Assessor's Department discussion, table of organization, office hours, and specifically vacancy, I think, is probably the most pressing of the issues. Mr. Gwartney. Before Mr. Gwartney begins, let me just say that also monthly, I try to meet with both the comptroller and the assessor along with Mr. Finger. I think those meetings have been productive. We normally deal with sensitive issues such as personnel, but we also deal with just how the departments are running and then any topics that might be up for discussion in the coming months. For the past 2 months, Mr. Finger and I have discussed with Mr. Gwartney his table of organization. Their town-wide or town hall-wide, I should say, there's been an issue raised with office hours. But the most pressing and really the main impetus for Mr. Gwartney to be here tonight and make his presentation is relative to a vacancy that was created as a result of a transfer. Was it a lateral? Or was it
no, it was an upward transfer.
Upward transfer within a collective bargaining unit, and therefore the person left the assessor's office. The position has remained vacant now for quite some time, and Mr. Gwartney would like to fill it, and we're here to decide from a table of organization standpoint what the feeling of the BET is. So I hope you've all read his report, and he's here to answer any questions tonight. Thank you, Mr. Gwartney.
Can I make a few comments?
Please.
In my regular report, there were 5 pages that start with this assessor's office staffing report and the following 5 pages. And just in summary, there was a revaluation overturned in late 1990s. And it was identified that the major reason for this was the understaffing of the assessment department. And a report and study was done indicating what the proper staff should be. And in 2001, it was actually implemented, and the staffing was brought up. And the whole idea was to facilitate in-house revaluations where the assessor's staff would be able to maintain all the records and do most of the work. And the outside consulting would be limited to modeling expertise on residential and commercial, and checking characteristics and handling the informal public hearings, those things that you need a little bit of extra assistance to get done, thus eliminating about 80% of the cost of a normal revaluation. I've attached a historic chart on the second page of my report that shows the actual total number of staff, the appraisal, clerical, and administrative. And you can see that in 2001, it was implemented at its level. Since that date, we've had reductions in clerical staff from 6 to then 5 in 2005, and then 4 in 2007, and then this year, 2009, there's a third. 3 of the 6 staff members are now not there. And we're arguing that it's necessary to fill that 4th position of the 6th, that we've been able to manage and live with a 1/3 reduction, but if we have a 50% reduction with the clerical staff, we'll not be able to do everything that we're required to do under statute. I also wanted to point out that we took the initiative to change our hours. Our hours had been 7:30 to 3:30, and we've now changed that. All employees are working from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. We've also eliminated flex time. We had a lot of flex time where people were allowed to have some flexibility in their schedules. And we're not giving any consideration to a 4-day work week or any other items. If you go next then to my staffing report, it looks like this. This outlines all of the work that the clerical staff does by category. And this was based upon a study that was done and submitted back in 2000. It was based upon actually measuring all the work that they did for a year. Now, we've made a lot of alterations to this. First of all, realizing that we're going to be getting this new computer inquiry system where the public will be able to search for information on their own is going to reduce the need for clerical staff time considerably. In fact, we've reduced the amount of time that we had budgeted in the past by 80%. For the printing of cards, preparation, and answering those kinds of questions. We've made other reductions for other areas where we've been able to do things more efficiently. However, over time, there's also been some increases that have been necessary. Greater numbers of building permits, greater numbers of personal property accounts. And then also on the senior local option, that didn't even exist when this study was made, so we had to add that in. And I've actually put in the amount of actual time that we spent last year on it. I have not budgeted any for any additional work that may result from the newly being considered senior extension of different benefits and so forth. On this chart, you can see that the staffing requirement is 5.8 people per year. Now, the way we manage that is with the 4 clerical staff, that's with the 1 that's vacant being filled, with the one administrative staff member who works in the clerical area, and the 8/10ths would be from overtime and from temporary assistance. And basically, by filling the position, we'll be able to live within our budget. The only problem I'm going to have is whether the senior local application is going to require a lot of extra time, but that's yet to be determined based upon what your board decides. So just in summary on my report, what I'm arguing is that we've already reduced our clerical staff by 1/3. We cannot reduce it by 50% and get the work done. We can live with a 1/3 reduction, but we simply cannot add another temporary on because they don't have the knowledge or the expertise to deal with the kinds of questions and problems that we're confronted with every day. And we need to have the vacancy filled as soon as possible because the elderly program is going to begin on February 1st, 2009, and if it's not filled at that point, it's going to be virtually impossible for the staff to keep up to date. Recently, I've had to actually transfer some of the clerical work to the appraisal staff, which I regret doing, but it was just necessary because I don't have the clerical staff to get everything done with the vacancy that we have at this point. So I'm recommending in a very firm way that you authorize the filling of this vacant administrative assistant position so that we can proceed with our work without interruption. Be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. Finger.
Mr. Gortney, we just point out to the board the circumstances under which or by which the the most recent vacancy came about in your department?
A very highly qualified lady that was doing excellent work was given a position of an administrator of employee benefits in the Human Relations Department. It's a very large increase in pay for her. She had the perfect qualifications for the job. She did not want to leave us, but she just could not turn down the pay increase and the opportunity to work in a field that she had great knowledge in. Actually, each one of the people that that we've lost has gone on to a higher level profession in the town and is doing excellent work.
Ted, you make reference to a temporary employee not having the expertise. Have you considered a permanent part-time or a more permanent position that's not a full-time person?
I was asked to fill the last vacancy I had, the number 2 vacancy, with a permanent part-time, and it was just difficult to find a person like that could really do it. The people are looking for continuity, staying with us, and the idea that they're kind of up in the air does not, set the right scene. So we rejected that idea. Now, we've been successful with living with 2 less clerical people, but this last one is going to cripple us, and I don't think that we could get the right person unless we offer it on a permanent basis.
Mr. Simon.
I have a couple of questions. What is the impact now that we've had fewer home sales, fewer building permits? What has the impact been on your office? And does that help obviate the need for this position?
The basic work of the office is still ongoing. The amount of work that the lower number of sales and building permits is not really significant in the total operations of the staff. If you look at the type of work they're doing, it's kind of constant work that has to be done no matter what. And while it may be offering some opportunities for saving a little bit of time here and there, it's not saving significant time where it would impact a position.
The other question I have is really for either the first selectman or the town administrator, that, some of the work you have is seasonal. Part of it deals with the Board of Assessment Appeals, part of it deals with the senior tax relief. And we have other departments that have equally seasonal activity which doesn't coincide with yours. Now, is there any thought given to maybe trying to create a skilled clerical workforce that can do multiple department work?
I think the concept of cross-training is not a new one. It's been talked about going back to when I was on the board initially, particularly as it relates to the collector's office, the clerk's office, primarily general government departments. The challenge has been to get buy-in from those department heads who are, in 2 cases, independently elected, to convince their staff to cross-train and shift them over to the department that has the particular demand at that given time. I think that would be the optimum way to go, because I do think you have peaks and valleys in the workloads in those departments. We can make an effort again to see if we can gain that level of cooperation to that concept. I would suggest that be the first step. In terms of a professional clerical pool, we have just begun to focus our attention on part-time, permanent part-time employees, as well as seasonal and temporaries, as we try to gain a better handle on the overall salaries counts and reducing expenditures. We are beginning to review those to look at the number, because we seem to see an increase over the past several years as BET guidelines have indicated no net increase in full-time equivalents. So to answer your question, we can do that, but recognize we're also going to be looking at constraining that area of the budget as well as we look to achieve your requirements of reduction in headcount and costs. Just to follow up on Peter's comments earlier, the situation as described by the governor and the economists, to whom she did not specify their name, very much focused on parallels between the Great Depression, that this is not something that anyone envisioned. It's not something that we should take lightly. And I think we've been very sensitive here and certainly impacted given our proximity to New York and our population. But I do not believe, and I think this is something maybe inherent in all of us, that we do have a full appreciation of the magnitude of this. To me, it becomes greater and greater every day as we meet with Roland and we meet with you, Larry, at our forecasts. So what I'm saying is we can do that, but recognize we may be at a point where we're not filling part-time positions and we're actually eliminating positions. I hesitate to say that because I don't like to instill uneasiness and fear, but at the same time, I think we have to be realistic about the prospects of what we're facing, particularly when they say that they don't see a better future until the end of 2009. So to answer your question, we'll try, but I'm not making promises I can't keep in terms of we maybe have to reduce staff, but I think the best approach is to get cross-training, because you're getting permanent people who are here day in and day out. They're in the building, and they do have an appreciation and understanding of what the other departments do. They work already together. Particularly, Ted, you can answer this. Out of the two, the tax collector or the assessor or the town clerk, which of the two would be more suited to support the functionality of your office?
The tax collector.
Okay.
If I could just also kind of answer the question, the way that we manage the peaks and valleys is that eight-tenth of a person. That's the budget that we have for part-time assistance and for overtime. And it's those two things that kind of take us through our peak periods when we don't have enough staff. Staff is willing to work overtime, and we're able to bring people from other places in the town hall to assist us, and we pay them, people that maybe have a part-time job elsewhere.
Mr. Stone?
Ted, looking at your data here on your analysis sheet, you've got some categories which show enormous volatility. The personal property line goes from a monthly high of 274 in November down to, well, really reaches 6.1 in June. And then just cherry picking the counter hours here in November of this year, of last year, I'm sorry, went from 112. Would seem like I would have thought that would have been somewhat consistent, but it showed it went from that level down to I guess 22 hours in January. Are those items and some of these others somewhat more controllable by your department so that it might spread the peak load out a bit?
No, because we're basically dealing with deadline dates. For example, in November is when people have to file their personal property declarations, and they come in armed with questions and with other matters that have to be dealt with. I&Es are a certain time of the year. We have all these things that have to be done within certain times of the year, and we always have kind of peaks and valleys in each function that we do, so the staff has to understand all the functions in order to be able to help one another. And every staff member does understand the entire workings of the operation, so that when we do run into a time where we have a lot of people that need to be right there working, solving a particular problem, everyone understands how to deal with it, and they all pitch in to get it done.
The underlying scheduling of those I guess client-driven requirements, though, are those something that you could possibly tweak?
Not really, because the not only does the state have deadlines and dates, but also the public has deadlines and dates. And when the tax bills go out, that's a particular time where we have a lot of inquiries and a lot of corrections. We have to make corrections for all the automobiles that get bought and sold during the year. So there are all these different things happening throughout the year. If anything, if you would ask me, well, if I filled the position and there was a time where I could free up a person during the year to help another department that needed it, sure, we'd be glad to do something like that. Because there are some times in the year where we encourage people to take vacations because the work is not as heavy as other times in the year. And we try to prohibit people taking vacations towards the end of the year, Christmas time, and early in the year, just because of the bulk of the work at the year end.
Thank you.
Mr. Campbell.
Just looking further at your chart, if I read it correctly, and maybe I don't, so correct me if you would, you have adjusted for the planned internet availability in the print cards and maps line.
Yes.
And you've estimated, I guess, if I do the math right, that you're going to save about 500 man hours there. Is that?
That's right.
About that.
Yes.
Would it also affect possibly the calls or the counter hours? Would any of that time be devoted to what now may be satisfied by the internet availability?
We reduced the calls by 40% and the counter hours by 50%. We did that by manipulating the amount of time spent, but it's the equivalent of making a 40 and 50% reduction in those two categories.
And those are reflected here?
Yes, Aaron.
I think the BET is faced with an interesting issue here. We have obviously bad economic times, and I think that's an understatement, faced with our own department head, one of two that report to the BET, looking to fill a position that, quite frankly, if the person had not taken the job and the vacancy didn't exist, I'm not sure we would be talking about it, or we would be contemplating eliminating the position. But the facts remain that the person did take the position, fortunately for them, and there is a vacancy. One of my concerns, and I think, Ted, from even your presentation to us, to both Bill Finger and to me, I guess it was last week, I think you've done an excellent job in making the case. I think the concern up here, at least from where I'm sitting, is I would hate to hire someone for the position, and even if it helps out the assessor's office in the near term, come to a situation where the first selectman is forced to start laying people off because we haven't been able, through attrition, to come up with positions that are necessary for us to balance the budget and to have a mill rate increase that's acceptable. So that's sort of where I am on this. I think you have made an excellent case to have a position. I'm not sure, due to no actions by yourself, that because of the financial crisis that we're faced with potentially eliminating this position. Those are just my sort of thoughts on it as we sit here tonight. Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments relative to the vacancy? Mr. Simon.
I'm also sympathetic to your needs. However, I'm more interested in some of the other comments that were made, which is the cross-training, finding ways of solving this on more of a town-wide basis. I think it's very difficult to ask and give you permission to hire somebody and then at the same time try to reduce the table of organization by 15 people or more. At the same time, we're trying to hold down the operating expenses for this year. And I would think that there are other ways perhaps to solve this problem than adding one more staff in terms of, as I said before, sharing the workload or perhaps reorganizing the way in which the work is done within the office. So I would be reluctant to, actually I would vote against approving the request until we feel we've exhausted further efforts to try and solve this problem without adding additional staff. And then maybe at that time, if we find ourselves totally frustrated and unable to get the work done, reconsider.
If I could just make two comments. One, when I did fill a clerical vacancy, there was a runner-up in a department which I think will be in a period of lull for some time. that was the runner-up that I think would not really hurt the department that would come from. And we really need the person, whereas I think that there may be other departments that can survive with one less person. In addition, I make the point that we would be willing, in filling this position, to make this person available to other departments as needed, that we would allow them to work for another department when they came into a peak period, such as the tax collector, for example, has some peak periods where they really need some assistance. And that would be one way of solving the problem of allowing a person to work in more than one function at some time.
Relative to whether or not another department has a runner-up, that really is under the first selectman's jurisdiction, and I hate to punt it to him, but ultimately that would be for that, if it's an appointing authority job or classification, then you would have that appointing authority also weighing in on whether or not they could reduce their table of organization. But I think for our purposes tonight, if that's a plan that ultimately works, that would have to be vetted through that process and not by this board. We can't direct the first selectman or an appointing authority if it falls within their department what to do. But I see your point. It would be an ultimate reduction of one across the town. Then again, if that position is not critical to the town, you could say that we could get 2 vacancies out of it. So interesting thought process, though.
I just have a question.
First, Mr. Finger. Sorry.
This doesn't help the situation, but we have another item on our agenda, which we may or may not be voting on today, and that being the Seniors and Citizens with Disability Tax Relief Ordinance. I'm not sure whether we're going to. Well, I suspect we're going to be voting on the assessor's staffing issue today or at this time. But I just want to point out that depending upon where we come out on the senior and disability tax relief, that may have an impact one way or another on the workload that the assessor's department has. So I just think we need to keep that in mind. Depending upon how the vote goes, we should maintain some level of flexibility depending upon how the other vote turns out.
Thank you. That's a very important point.
Mr. Mason.
I have a similar concern to that, but I guess my question would be, the position that is now vacant in the assessor's office has a salary benefit cost of, on a replacement annually, of what? What's that number?
The salary itself is around $35,000 plus benefits.
So we're talking about benefits on top of that at 30%. So we're still at 40,000. And if we left that position open, we have 2/3 of that we're going to recoup because we're a third of the way into the year. We have 2/3 of the way to go. Going back to what the other appointing authorities can do, and obviously you have the first selectman, the town administrator. If that is a number back to the rest of your budget doesn't absorb 30,000. But with a that'll probably be over the winter time. Possible to. That would be my position.
If it comes down to a matter of finding $35,000 in the budget, I would do whatever I had to cut out $35,000 from everything else. So that we had this position filled, because I think it's going to be devastating without the position filled, primarily for the for the senior program, but in addition to that, it's the last graduation, and we expect that 2009 is going to be a very extremely busy year, just like 2005 was. So if it's cost savings we need, I'll do my best to find the cost savings, but I cannot sacrifice the employee.
Comments, questions? Ms. Barton.
I'm sympathetic to the idea, which I've heard raised by members of this board, that we should not be increasing headcount in a department that is under our control at a time when we're asking the town to cut. But I look at a vacancy differently from an increase in headcount. And I'm very concerned about the potential impact on the elderly tax relief program and the revaluation. So I'm not hearing any immediate solutions to those problems from the alternatives that have been discussed, and that is giving me a lot of concern. These are things that are going to happen very soon or are ongoing. It isn't something that's going to happen next June.
I think really, just to lay it out, the options before this board are as follows. Approve the position, and so status quo, and therefore we would be directing you to contact the HR department to let them know that we believe that the position should be filled. The other option, going to the other side of the spectrum, would be to say don't fill it and eliminate it from the table of organization. So that's sort of the universe. And then there could be a direction for whether it's use temporary assistance and telling you to use whatever means necessary to fill it through temporary means, or then through a permanent part-time. That, I think, is really all of the options that we have before us, unless somebody else has any other option. The option about using some other department's personnel, I'm not sure is really within our bailiwick here tonight. And while it's an interesting thought process, I think it really has to be vetted through the First Selectman's office if that's even possible. So I guess the other option would be to table this, which I would prefer not to do, because I think you need some closure and you need to start either working and hiring a full-time or some other part-time or whatever else it may be. So based on my comments, does anybody have any thoughts? Mr. Mason.
I would rather not. Discussions we're going to have all year. I mean, this is going to be every appointing authority is going to have the same issues.
Mr. First Selectman.
I think it's important to leave here tonight with an understanding about roles. It always comes back to this in just about everything, and it's a matter of communication. I understand why you have this before you tonight, twofold. One, you're looking at the senior tax relief ordinance, the potential impact changes it will have on the administration of the department in implementing that program. You're looking at it in context of the budget and the impact it will have as it relates to this year's budget as we try to manage to our ability to control the cost. But I do think once you approve the budget, the authority over the filling of positions is really not yours. It's the Human Resources Department. And if you're going to take this tack, then what if another department takes that tack? You essentially, or another appointing authority, and I understand how you're different in terms of you control the money, but once you approve it, the discretion is really left up to the Human Resources Department, which reports in to the Office of the First Selectman. With one breath, you give the directive, you want a reduction in positions. You say that explicitly in your guidelines. We very carefully evaluate them. I have no problem with you giving me your judgment on it, but when you start saying it's going to go to committees of your board, and maybe I misunderstood, but I heard the Human Resources Committee, and we're going to get micromanagement on every time a vacancy comes up, you're going to have bedlam. You're not going to have sound management of the town. You're going to have micromanagement. So I want clarification. Bill's point, Mr. Finger's point's well taken. If we're going to do cross-training, I want some resolution or statement from this board that they would work with me toward getting it achieved, because what you have is a department that's independently elected. It's a finance function, tax collector. If I can point to the Board of Estimates saying, yes, we would support an initiative to cross-train employees in the tax collector's office so that they would be fluent in the responsibilities of the jobs and assessor, that would be great. We also have to check, I believe, collective bargaining agreements to make sure we can achieve that. So what I'm saying is I'm a little concerned about where the conversation is now leading to, because it's getting to the point where it's getting micromanagerial, and we're talking about one position out of 1,050. You know, I think it's a very legitimate concern, particularly given the effort we have already taken to review them very carefully. And, you know, I am acutely aware of the needs of the assessor's office. And, you know, Ted, I'm not saying we won't work with you. We are working with you, but there has to be some balance, and there has to be uniform standards, I think, in how we approach it. We can't have double standards.
Mr. First Selectman, I don't think you should be concerned relative to what our direction here is. I think it's more to give guidance to the assessor, and as I've laid out from the 3 points, whether or not it's the table of organization might even be decreased as opposed to micromanaging. So I think we're looking here tonight to just simply make a decision that way, to give him direction as to where to go forward with this. So
I guess that's the question. Is it at this point? We're asked to approve every vacancy that comes up. We make a decision. So am I to understand by the action tonight that this is going to be the situation on a go-forward basis with all openings, or is it just taking place because this is one of the positions under a department that the BET oversees? And if so, in my mind, in a way, it sets a double standard. And it has to be clearly explained. If there's a legal reason for it, which I don't see, once you approve the budget, the resources are in the hands of the Human Resources Department to determine, and they report through me. You're giving me guidance. So what I feel like's happening is I'm ceding my responsibility and authority to you. So no matter what I say or do on this, you're going to veto it, or and that unto itself, I think, creates a bigger problem.
I think the role here was really, we have two departments that report to us, where we're simply having one of our department heads give us a presentation as to a vacancy. There's been a lot of discussion regarding this vacancy. The assessor has asked for it to be filled through the HR department. They have rejected his request to fill it, and I think it's important that this body weigh in on that as to whether or not the position whether or not the department head has the support of the BET to continue to ask for the filling of that position. Because if in fact there isn't support on this board to fill the position, then that gives clear direction to the two people who report to us, one of the two people who report to us, a direction as to where to go. And I would hope that all other appointing authorities would have that discussion with their department heads as to whether or not they would ask that the First Selectman's office fill the position. I don't think we're looking to take away authority from the First Selectman or to have you cede authority on the filling of the position. It certainly still goes through the HR committee, but I think it is imperative that the BET understand its role and responsibility relative to the department heads. Mr. Finger.
Ted, if I could ask another question. The counter hours that you provide to the public, is that are those hours 8 to 4 the full time that your department is open to the public?
Yes.
I mean, is your department, you're open from 8 to 4 to the public?
Yes.
And call hours again, 8 to 4?
8 to 4.
So it's conceivable, and I'm not asking you to tell me how, or I'm not telling you how to manage your department, nor am I asking you to answer definitively one way or the other, but it's conceivable that should this board not have you fill that position, that one way to deal with the lack of an additional clerical person is to cut back hours to the public, and obviously that's reducing the service level to the public. Might that happen?
Yes, that would be possible.
Mr. Simon.
I think that's an inevitable consequence of trying to reduce the total budget and the workforce, which is if either people can choose to have reduced services or they can choose to have lower taxes, but they can't have higher service levels or constant service levels and lower taxes, and you have to make a decision. And I don't think repeating myself, how we could possibly say we need to reduce staff, control operating expense, while at the same time allowing you to fill a vacancy because you're, encouraging. I don't know exactly if we authorize you to fill a vacancy through the HR department, but as Mr. Tessie said, if he's trying to control his operating expenses, if we're trying to increase fund balance for next year, every person you hire decreases the fund balance. And if you have the $35,000 in your budget that you're not spending on the person and you don't need it, that also can go to fund balance. And we are faced with a problem not on the magnitude of the state of Connecticut, but still for the town of a sizable amount. So I'm looking for every dollar. And if it means, in my mind, fewer, longer waits at the counter, fewer phones being answered, or what other decisions we make, we can make that choice, or we can choose to have higher taxes. But we can't have both. And at this point, I'm voting for the mill rate that we've had and a lower service level.
Mr. Simon, is that in the form of a motion?
Well, I'm not sure what we're voting.
Well, we would be voting.
3 choices, right?
I would suggest you have 4 choices, but one of which would be to simply direct the assessor not to fill the position with a full-time, not to request a full-time position, and to simply do some other action, which I've laid out, which is either a part-time or a temporary or a permanent part-time.
See, I'm not unhappy with the existing process, which is he's requested it to be filled. The first selectman and the town administrator together have deemed it not of critical importance to fill it. If they think it's of critical importance, then they should fill it. I don't object to that process. I like that process.
So you would not move it off the table of organization? Because isn't that what our direction was?
Well, I'm not sure what we do with all of the unfilled vacancies that we're not filling on the table of organizations. Are we trying to clean up the table of, are we trying to, I'm not sure where we're going in that direction.
Position, but I don't think that was up for consideration at this moment, was to fill it or not fill it.
Well, when you, Mr. First Selectman, when you do not fill a position, do you count that as one of the 15, even though it stays on the table of organization?
Two things were going on. Initially, it was just delaying filling positions to realize budgetary savings. As the situation became more grave, it went to not filling positions without prioritization in terms of public safety. We've gone ahead and filled, or if something was in process. But on a go-forward basis, essentially the article that was out there, we've frozen filling positions. In terms of whether or not we're going to eliminate them, I don't think the conversation has taken place on this particular one as of yet. That may be something that occurs as we get into looking to realize your goal of 15 positions. I believe we have 6. We may have had to revert backward to 5 based upon a state arbitration panel's decision due to a 2003 action. But we weren't at this point eliminating it. We were just not filling it indefinitely.
I think we're in the position, though, if we take no action on this, we have a department head who is requesting a position to be filled. You have a situation where the position is not, at least at this point, going to be filled, and that would allow status quo to remain, because I believe the decision of the HR department through the First Selectman's office is to not fill this position at this time.
That is their directive.
Right.
That is their directive.
So by us taking no action on this, then that status quo would remain until such time as the first selectman deemed it appropriate to allow the vacancy to be filled on a full-time permanent basis. So that's what our inaction would result in tonight. Mr. Stone.
I think there's one more piece that hasn't been clarified, and that is the position of the first selectman and with the input of the Human Resources Director, who unfortunately is no longer here tonight, concerning the possible transfer in from another department. We're looking at a relatively small department in terms of personnel, which has been reduced in staff significantly, percentage-wise. And in comparison to the other departments and offices out there, and looking at their staffing, it seems reasonable that among these other departments, there is a redundancy that could help this particular department out. And I would certainly prefer to get that input concerning the possible availability of a person to be moved in, at least on I hesitate using the word temporary, but at least let's call it less than a definitive one-year period, but a person who could be moved in from a department that would temporarily help the short staffing in the assessor's office, and at the same time not increase the table of organization in the town.
Ms. Tarkington, and we'll wrap it up.
Yes, I think, over the last 3 years, there's really been, at least 3 years that I'm familiar with, a process in place where the first selectman, where the HR committee has worked with the budget committee, and there's been, identified numbers in the table of organization which the first selectman needs to achieve. And while each of the appointing authorities have provided input to the HR director or to the first selectman, we've really allowed the process overall that I've seen to rest with the first selectman. I think that today's meeting is excellent because it's probably given the first selectman some guidance in terms of the thought process of the town assessor, of many of the members of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. It's also perhaps presented some ideas for new techniques that could be used, not necessarily with the assessor's office, but maybe, cross-training in other departments. But I think for this board to make an actual decision on this will alter the process that seems to be working, and there is a goal for the first selectman to achieve, and that is he has a headcount reduction of 15 persons voted upon by this board, and to make that work, he really has to achieve that by July 1st. I think that, the assessor needs to, as well as the first selectman, understand the sensitivity of this board and the first selectman, as he presented earlier, to a constraining budget and to the environment around us. And we're all concerned about the head count and the numbers that we have to achieve. But, I agree with Mr. Simon. I think that the Budget Committee has put forth certain constraints, and we have a process in place. If we differ from that process in the BET, other appointing authorities will want to do it also. And I guess that's my concern after listening to this conversation, that unless we want to change a process that's been working for 3 years and goals that we've laid out, should we get involved with the details of this? And I was surprised the first selectman said, because I hadn't really thought, I had thought of more the policy of the HR committee and not getting down to the individual decisions. And to date, we haven't gotten involved in the individual decisions, but we've been fortunate that the first selectman has worked with the HR director and the department heads to make decisions that I think all have agreed upon and that comply with the directives in the budget guidelines.
Any other comments?
Just one final comment. I think the concept of getting resources, existing resources, and applying them to where they're directly needed, as Mr. Stone noted, it was noted really by Mr. Finger too, in terms of you have a demand at a particular time, is a worthy one of pursuing. And I think the conversation we need to have is with Maureen Cast and Al Cava as to our ability to temporarily transfer like employees. I know that there are classifications and people have to work within them, but it's really a matter of collective bargaining, and that's something that in this environment I think people would be receptive to, because the bottom line, they still have a job. It may not just be doing something different. And so if anything came out of this discussion tonight, it's that we're going to need to research this, and if it's viable, which I certainly hope it will be, we apply it, and it becomes, again, a resource for us in these times when we're really up against the wall to achieve some savings to keep this year's budget sound.
So is it the sense then that we take no action on this particular vacancy, but what the assessor should take from that as well is that the decision by the first selectman's office at this point to not fill the position should be respected, and that upon the ability to fill the position, they'll be in contact with the assessor's office.
We'll work with Ted. We'll work with Ted to see if we can go through, as we suggested, if there are available positions where the department isn't facing a peak demand and we can transfer the person for however many months, 3 months, 4 months, then I'm amenable to that. I think that's a very practical and fair solution, because it's giving him someone who's currently in the employ of the town, who's not starting from ground zero, to fulfill some of the work obligations.
I'll make a motion to that effect.
Okay, so Mr. Norton, you're making a motion to the effect of that we take no action on this?
Yes.
I second that.
It's a motion by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Simon, that we're taking no action, which would be, I think, for clarity more of the minutes than for anything else. It would clarify our position and give a clear direction to the assessor that, in fact, it would be no action, and that the assessor should abide by the direction of the HR committee, HR department, and the first selectman's office. Is that right?
Yes.
Any other discussion?
Yes.
Mr. Mason.
So going back to my original point, so we are going to leave the position effectively in the TOO. We're just not going to, we're going to go by what the first selectman's doing. As I said before, not micromanaging, to leave the position open, but we're not officially pulling the position from the table of organization at this point.
That's right, and the only time that the BET would then deal with this issue along with others will be at the time of the budget.
So it's very clear to the assessor that as he builds his budget for next year, that
it's in there, correct?
That position still exists.
There's a 3.8% increase in the 100 line, for the salary line, and that includes that position.
Yes, it does.
Mr. Stone.
Just a clarification and maybe a modification of this motion, and that is that there be a specific request to the first selectman that, which I don't believe is being acted on at this point, that an attempt be made to find elsewhere among town employees reporting to the first selectman someone who can fill this slot for several months anyway.
I think our minutes can reflect that discussion in the first selectman clearly. I'm not sure we need a formal correspondence, but I think our minutes should at least reflect that. Ms. Barton.
I don't think we need to vote on anything. I think we just need to move on.
Well, thank you. Well, the motion's been made. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention?
Abstain.
Abstain, one abstention. Next item on the, under number 10, new business, vote to approve seniors and citizens with disabilities tax relief ordinance. Mr. Mason.
Good evening, everyone. Before we have a handout, which before I get
revise a section which in essence will allow the BET to set a maximum at the time. Several members had questions and concerns. Next question was raised about the with all that discussion, the revised language being requested special meeting this afternoon. The draft is before you now. Budget committee has included ask that this be to the RTM.
which will be their January meeting, if I'm understanding that correctly. And we're asking for a first reading on this. And it basically has language in it that has been changed from the Budget Committee and from the Law Department. It has some items in it, but what I would ask, Mr. Chairman, is if you may, is to refer this back to our group for a review, for them to come back to our Budget Committee meeting in December to make the final presentation to us on this. But this document has been through the Budget Committee 3-0. Mr. Crumick wasn't able to attend. He was in favor of 3 of the 4 modifications last week when he was there. The one modification that he did not vote in favor of, he has not seen yet, or at least has not been able to offer a vote on because he's not here. But other than that, that is where we are with the proposed tax relief for the elderly.
Thank you, Mr. Mason. I do know, and I will note that there were 3 members of the BET who also served on the committee, 2 representing the BET, 1 representing the First Selectman. That'd be Larry Simon, Leslie Tarkington, and Ed Crumick. There has been a lot of discussion over the past week or so on this item. Mr. Gortney, it's my understanding, and I've asked this question I think a couple times now, but just so that it's clear and so the record is clear, while you would have preferred to have this resolved in December to give ample time to send out notices for any tax relief or tax credit, the January 20th deadline simply imposes a push between January 20th and February 1st, which is the first day that one can make the application. Is that correct?
Yes, with some qualification. We've already had a couple of hundred people telephone asking to be eligible for the new program, and they have been expecting a decision to be made in December. So they'll be wondering what is happening. And I think when we get into January, there'll be more questions coming up, and the press will be coming up. So it gets to be difficult the longer you put it off. And if we do put it off until the 20th of January, we'll basically send out a blank form, not saying anything about what the requirements are in terms of, until they're passed, the income requirements or the benefits or anything.
Well, couldn't the assessor's office generate a template for the application, knowing that there might be some changes both from the BET and from the RTM, but having a basic framework of what's being discussed now, and that way having that form ready to go with final revisions on the 21st or so?
Yes, we'll definitely do that, and we'll get them in the mail the next day. I'm just saying, though, that there is the public expectation that's going to be all through the month of January.
Well, hopefully Mr. Borsa can help us out with that and getting out information as to where we are in the process.
No, I'm kind of annoyed that the discussion took too long before. So. Don't get any favors.
BET gets punished.
Yeah. So with this, I would ask that this be referred to the Budget Committee, but that it work through our, what I'll call our three liaisons, in particular our two liaisons who represented the BET on this, and that any suggested changes be one specific, if you're going to make any changes, and we're going to work off of the draft that the Budget Committee adopted tonight, or that says draft November 17th of 2008, and that those changes be presented to Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Simon, and Mr. Kremick. December 9th is the BET Budget Committee meeting. So I would suggest that any suggested changes be to those three BET members no later than December 3rd. Does that work for everyone?
Let's go for the first.
Or earlier. I agree.
The first?
Yeah, first.
People seem to have opinions about this, and so hopefully we've talked about it already for the week. And so if you still have an opinion that is different from the proposed draft, if you could make that known to the three individuals, that would be helpful. What also I think we should try to do is to make sure that the Commission on Aging get a copy of those so that they can prepare a response, or if they have an opinion relative to at least what's being discussed, so that on the 9th they'd be prepared as well to discuss those changes so that they're not coming new and then we have to go back out and get some more revisions. Mr. Guarney, I'm sure you're going to be on call again for modeling questions if there are any. And Mr. McLaughlin, most likely we're going to be asking you to either continue with what's drafted or then make revisions between the 9th and the 15th, I think, is our next meeting.
15th.
Good, so we'll take that up in December. And Mr. First Selectman, then that you're going to then propose this to the RTM in January?
We have no other choice. The town clerk had reserved a spot for December's meeting, but in light of the fact that you'll be taking another month, what I'm contemplating is maybe we just send a report advising them as to the status, since there's been such publicity about it, and let them know maybe what some of the issues are. And we can work with Mr. Dabler and the town administrator just to communicate very simply what the status of the item is, so that they're anticipating and they get some baseline information as to what the issues are in terms of enhancing the credit, what the Board of Selectmen did with deferral, and also the inclusion of permanently disabled as a consideration.
Our third item under new business, approval of the finance budget and operational plan, you should have received in your packet. Any questions or comments? Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Norton. This is to approve both the budget and the operational plan. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Before we conclude, let me just say that December does appear to be gearing up to be a fairly lengthy meeting. We have the town administrator who's going to give a presentation on the city view, and we'll have the elderly tax relief, and we'll have the Hay study, and those are just the three. I believe by then we'll have the Welsh-Carson contract as well, and the audit. So it'll be a heavy agenda relative to the topics. That's another reason just why everyone, if you can, any questions especially regarding the Hay and the elderly tax relief. Please get those questions out sooner rather than later, which will hopefully have a much more controlled conversation about those topics for next month. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Gortney, for attending. Is there a motion to adjourn?
There is. To adjourn.
Second? Good. Thank you. Me.